Great. Well, first I'll start by just saying the general idea of the Common Core, and then I'll get into the nitty-gritty about who some of the key figures are. So for a while, there's been this move that says America needs education standards, and education standards are, they set certain benchmarks or identify certain tasks people should be able to do at a certain point in their life. So you're going to say that at the end of the third grade, you must be able to do this in math, or at the end of fifth grade, you must be able to do this in English. And there is a sense that they give education purpose, that if you can focus education towards these standards, that you're ensuring that everybody gets a good education. And the two main groups that have been supporting national education standards are the business community, which says, listen, we want schools to focus on the tasks that we think are important, which are math and literacy and numeracy. And the other major group has been the civil rights organizations for standards and accountability, what political scientists call CROSAS. So what happens is that you have a constituency at the heart of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and they've come together on this issue. And it was really manifest in 2001 with No Child Left Behind, and it continues up to the present with the recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act called the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so part of the appeal has said, listen, we need to get all kids ready for college and careers. We need them to compete in the global economy. I mean, there's just infinite reasons you can give for why Americans ought to be smarter. So that there's been, for at least for a while, there's been a growing support for the idea of national education standards. Although I think it's important to see that the story of this endeavor has changed dramatically in recent years, and so hopefully we'll get to that in our discussion. Let me get a little bit of the specifics of where did this idea of national education standards come from. And I think the story where I'm going to tell it starts in the 1980s, where Marshall Smith is a professor at University of Wisconsin and his graduate student Jennifer O'Day, they circulate this paper that gets published in 1990 called Systemic Education Reform. And this is just one of the most important documents to understand where the Common Core is coming from. Because what they say in this document is that for an educational system to work, think of like a clock, to think of it to work, you need all of the pieces in alignment. So you need standards that say what kids do. You have tests that measure the standards. You have accountability measures to make sure that the students are learning the standards and the teachers are teaching the standards and the schools are using the standards. You need to align this with professional development or teacher training, with programs that teachers take while they're teachers. The publishers, the curricula, it all has to be aligned, and the key part that aligns it is the standards. And so this document gets published in 1990. Marshall Smith goes on to become the dean at Stanford Graduate School of Education. He's Assistant Secretary of Education during the Clinton administration. And he's actually the first hire by the Obama administration for the Education Department. So Marshall Smith is one of the figures going back to the 1980s up to the present who has been pushing it. The second major event I want to talk about is this 1989 governor's meeting. And what's important about this governor's meeting is not so much what they agree to, because what they agree to is going to change over time. But what's important is that it's the framing of education as a national problem that requires a national solution that largely relies upon standards, tests, and accountability measures. And one of the key figures there was a governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And another key figure was his assistant at the National Governors Association, Michael Cohen. And Michael Cohen would go on to work with the Clinton administration's Department of Education. And he would later go on to found Achieve, which was an organization really designed as a clearinghouse of information to sort of keep up institutional memory of education reform based in the nation's capital, supported by a lot of very wealthy organizations, Exxon, Mobil, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Boeing, statewide insurance, or State Farm Insurance. And so the fact is that starting in 1989, you start getting this think tank world in Washington, D.C. mobilized towards pushing for national education standards, and Achieve Incorporated is actually the group that led the writing of the Common Core state standards. So this group has been building for decades. That in 1994 there was Improving America's Schools Acts that is saying that states, to get Title I money, they needed standards that were testing in the three core subjects of math, English language arts, and science. It actually didn't go very far because it faced a lot of Republican opposition. But in 2001, we have No Child Left Behind Act, which says that each state is supposed to have standards, testing, and accountability mechanisms. And so that really, maybe that's one of the major turning points to getting us towards national education standards. But No Child Left Behind technically allowed states to come up with their own education standards. 2009, Obama launches the Race to the Top program. And the Race to the Top program is a competitive grants program that states submit applications for about $4.3 billion worth of money, which was granted to the Department of Education as a discretionary fund from the stimulus package, the American Recoveries and Rehabilitation Act. So the Race to the Top program awarded money to states if they satisfied certain criteria. They'd get certain points if they did certain things. And one of the main ways to score a lot of points was to adopt the Common Core. Technically, there was another route that institutions of higher education in states could approve a different set of standards, but virtually no state chose that route. So 2009, you see over 40 states, the District of Columbia, U.S. military, some of the sort of parts like Guam and Puerto Rico. I mean, all these places are adopting the Common Core. And what happens is effectively in 2010, you have de facto national education standards in math and English and language arts, which is the Common Core.
It's a very simple thing. It's a written explanation of what knowledge kids should achieve at various milestones in their educational career. So it's writing down in 6th grade which math things should you know, in 9th grade which math things should you know, in 12th grade which math things should you know. And you might be surprised to learn how poor those, I'll call those standards, but to be clear, it's not curriculum, it's not a textbook, it's not a way of teaching, it's just writing down, should you know this part of algebra, should you know trigonometric functions, should you know, be able to recognize a graph of this type. And doing that very well is hard because there's certain dependencies, if you teach it in the wrong order, if you try and teach too much at once, too much too early, which the US was doing a lot of that, it can be very, very poor. And if you compare, we had 50 of these things, and there was quite a bit of divergence. Some states had trigonometry, some didn't. Some had pie charts, some didn't. And so ironically, what had happened was the textbook companies had gone in and told the committees that make these things up that they should add things over time. And so we had math textbooks over double the size of any of the Asian countries. And we had the ordering in almost every one of our 50, which is strange. You'd think if you had 50, one of them would randomly be really, really well ordered. Yeah. Some were more ambitious than others. So for example, being high, that is having the 12th grade expectation be high, there were a few like Massachusetts were quite good in that respect. And so when kids from Massachusetts take international tests or SAT, anything, they do better, better than the rest of the country. And so often when you see those country rankings, they'll take Massachusetts and show you where it would be if it was a separate country. And it's way past the US that now is virtually at the bottom of any of the well-off countries, with the Asian countries totally dominating the top 6 slots now. Finland had a brief period where they were up high, and now they're not even the European leader anymore. So a bunch of governors said, hey, you know, why are we buying these expensive textbooks? Why are they getting so thick? You know, are standards high enough or quality enough? And I think it was the National Governors Association said we ought to get together on this. A bunch of teachers met with a bunch of experts. And so in reading and writing and math, these knowledge levels were written down. And at some point, 46 states had adopted that curriculum, a variety of competitive curriculum, now that small companies can get into it because it's not just doing a book for Florida. And so the sort of barrier to entry that was created by the large firms there goes away. The idea that those committees rev it so you can't use the old textbooks, you know, that idea will go away. Because in math, this can have real durability. Changing your math standards, it's not like some new form of math is being invented. And there has been, in a sense, a national expectation. When you take the SAT test, it has trigonometry on it. So if you're in a state that doesn't have that, you're going to get a low score. And they use a certain notation in the way they do the math. And certain states were different than that, so you're screwed. If you move from state to state,
in the vernacular,
you experience discontinuity because of this. And it's made it very hard to compare things. And this is an era where we have things like Khan Academy that are trying to be a national resource, and yet you sit down, it'll tell you, are you up to the 6th grade level? Are you up to the 9th grade level? Are you ready to graduate from high school? And so this Common Core was put together. If somebody and states will decide this thing. Nobody is suggesting that the federal government will, even in this area, which is not curriculum, will dictate these things. States can opt in, they can opt out. As they do that, they should look at this status quo, which is poor. They should look and find something that's high achievement, that's got quality. And if they can find something that's that, if they have two they're comparing, they ought to probably pick something in common. Because to some degree, this is an area where if you do have commonality, it's like an electrical plug, you get more free market competition. Scale is good for free market competition. Individual state regulatory capture is not good for competition. And so this thing in terms of driving innovation, you'd think that sort of pro-capitalistic market-driven people would be in favor of it. But you know, somehow it's gotten to be controversial. And you know, states will decide. Whatever they want to decide is fine. But at the end of the day, it does affect the quality of your teaching, does affect when your kids go to take what are national level tests, whether they are going to do well or not do well.
Okay, so here's what I think went wrong. So if you ask people, if you do a poll and say, do you like the idea of high education standards? Nearly everybody is going to say yes, right? The devil is in the details. That if you're going to have a system that's aligned on a national scale, that, you know, the proverbial 74 million people, you need a certain way to measure this on a massive scale. And the only way to do that is tests. The only way that tests can measure standards if the standards align themselves carefully to tests. So all of a sudden, things that can't really become measured by national test and standards get pushed out of the curriculum. If you're going to actually create this national standards and testing that people take seriously, you have to make it high stakes, which means that teachers can get fired if kids don't learn the standards, or kids can be held back or not be admitted to certain schools if they do poorly on the tests. So what it means is that in something like the Common Core, you need a methodology that lends itself easily to testing. And the way that the Common Core does this is this skill, and I'm focusing on English and language arts right now, is to focus on this skill called close reading. So what happens is you're given a passage of text and you're asked questions about past evidence from the text, right? You're supposed to give text-dependent and text-specific answers to questions. So, my wife and I sometimes talk about it, which is just how infuriating it is that our son, when he does his homework, is not allowed to use synonyms, right? We think that he's really being taught to plagiarize because you have to use the exact words in the text. There was a really remarkable article in Salon about computer-graded essays. And one of the things is that there's handwriting reading technology out there, right? The post office uses it. So now they're talking about ways that this is actually being implemented with Pearson in the PARC test, is that you can have computers grade essays. And so they need to make sure that you're using the exact words that are in the text as part of your answer. Now, I'll admit that there are certain points when you need to have this skill, right? That there's plenty of occasions where you need to be precise. But what you're effectively telling kids is that you're never allowed to offer your own perspective because you have to use the words in the text. And you're never allowed to make connections between a thing you read once and something you read at another point in your life. So as a professor, I often give assignments where I'm saying, listen, I want you to make connections between what you're reading and other things that you've read, right? If you're reading about Machiavelli, I want you to be able to see a connection to how he's fighting Plato, right? That you can't really understand Machiavelli when he talks about these imaginary principalities unless you understand that he's really thinking about Plato. The Common Core effectively forbids that, right? You won't get any points. You can actually lose points if you start bringing in things that are outside of the text. So think about what's involved in a really good educational system. Like if you're thinking for your own kids, what kind of education do you want? Well, you want them doing science, history, physical education. You want them going on field trips. You want them doing apprenticeships. You want them doing school plays. You want them learning math and English. What the Common Core does is it says, we are going to focus on these two subjects, but it's not even math and English, it's Common Core math and Common Core English. So all of a sudden you get this narrow slice of what education could be is being presented as the entirety of education. And so when you look at the test refusal numbers, that in 2013, the numbers were low. Parents were just waking up to this national phenomenon. I mean, I was reading a secondary source that was sort of bragging that the Common Core was stealth national standards. That's true. It was stealth national standards. Parents didn't see what was happening. 2014, 2015, 2016, those numbers are growing exponentially every year because parents are realizing this is what the Common Core means in practice. And that's unacceptable for my kids.
When we talk about implementation, if we want to be in substance land and not political land, then we should talk about particulars. We should talk about a district and a state. We should talk about going to the teachers and saying, okay, did this go too fast? Did you need more training? What should happen here? And you bet, this is complicated stuff. Go into a few states and get into particulars, and I think you'll find that those summaries don't match up to the substance, but you will find things that, hey, should be changed, will change. Takes time to roll something like this out. In the case of Kentucky, they started 5 years ago. In Colorado, they started 4 years ago. Was that enough? Did they bring the right people in? I mean, this is serious stuff. And so, oversimplistic statements about it aren't really advancing the idea that, hey, this will have kids learning math in a far better progression. I mean, we should really get into why is this progression so much better, and why didn't this happen earlier? That's the substance of a kid who goes to college and gets put into remedial math. We should be talking about those examples. We should be talking about those kids.
So the Common Core initiative is a top-down initiative. There's a remarkable Washington Post article in 2014, the spring, that confirmed what parents had been on the internet. We had been sharing information, and what it was about was how Bill and Melinda Gates met with the Common Core architect, David Coleman, and head of the CCSSO, Council of Chief State Schools Officers, Gene Wilhoit. The four of them met, and basically Coleman pitched the idea of the Common Core to Bill and Melinda Gates, and they liked it, and as pretty much, I think, the richest man in the world, Bill Gates was able to fund the writing of the standards, which is technically against the law for the federal government to pay for that. So he paid for that. And they gave, the Washington Post article detailed where about $250 million went to pay key constituencies to do research. But if you're critical of the process, it kind of looks like groups were bought off, right? The teachers' unions, Parent Teachers Association, all sorts of civil rights organizations for standards and accountability, all sorts of schools of education. And so it became very much this top-down initiative that I think contributed to many of the problems.
Well, it's important to separate out two things. There's how much resource and energy is going into new ideas and trying new things out. And then there's the question of what gets chosen to be adopted. And in terms of what gets chosen to be adopted, that's determined by school boards, governors, superintendents, and we're not a factor in terms of giving in those races or speaking out in those races. So they'll pick, they'll talk to the teachers, they'll talk to the parents, they'll pick what they choose to do. The role of the foundation has come in as saying, okay, the number of new approaches where teachers have an idea, are they getting funding to try out that idea? And so if the pool of choices that are out there for these political decisions to pick from is larger, including some that involve technology, some that involve teachers getting more feedback than they get today, studying those teachers who are amazing. We did 20,000 hours of taping. We looked at the characteristics. We want all teachers to benefit from the very best teachers. And I think in education, every field of endeavor, you can say, what's its research percentage? The guys who search for oil, they spend a lot of money researching new tools. Medicines, they spend a lot of money finding new tools. Software, it's a very R&D-oriented industry. The funding in general of what works in education, even studying these great teachers, is tiny. So the R&D percentage is the lowest in this field of any field of human endeavor, and yet you could argue it should be the highest because this is the field that's catalytic to, are you good at jobs, how innovative is your economy? And so we are, in a technocratic way, we are funding pilot studies of peer evaluations, like in Hillsborough. We're funding people doing software things. And so, yes, we create, if those things go well, which some do not, then we create more options. But, our voice is not there when the final choice of what to scale up is made. That's a governor, a superintendent, a school board who decides all those things.